The sea was black, that night blacker than ink, blacker than coal smoke. It was the Pacific in 1943, a few hours past midnight, when the USS O'Bannon, a Fletcher-class destroyer, sliced through the darkness at flank speed. The moon was gone, smothered behind heavy clouds. The crew on watch saw only shifting shadows on the waves and the faint glow of red battle lamps bleeding through hatch seams. The war had turned the ocean into a hunting ground. Every sound mattered. Every silhouette could mean death. And in the early hours of April 5th, as the O'Bannon advanced through waters patrolled by Japanese submarines, the night suddenly broke open. A shape surfaced where there should have been none. Lo! Metal. Rising straight out of the water. A Japanese submarine, unexpected, dangerously close, and at point-blank range. For a heartbeat, the two vessels stared at each other across a few dozen yards of open water. Too close for the destroyer's main guns. Too sudden for the submarine to dive. One wrong move, and the Pacific would swallow men from both sides. And in that impossible moment, a simple flashlight nothing more set the stage for what came next, drawing us into the deeper story behind that night. By early 1943, the war in the Pacific had settled into a brutal rhythm of night battles, submarine ambushes, and desperate attempts to control the vast island chain stretching from the Solomons to the Gilberts. The United States Navy, still recovering from the shock of 1942, was adapting at a rapid pace. Destroyers fast, agile, and built for escort and screening duties had become the nervous system of the fleet. They were expected to handle everything: scouting, convoy protection, anti-aircraft screens, and the deadly cat-and-mouse duels with Japanese submarines that lurked along every shipping lane. The Imperial Japanese Navy still held dangerous advantages beneath the waves. Their submarines, though fewer in number than America's, were large, long-ranged, and commanded by officers trained to stalk surface ships with methodical precision. Some operated alone. Others were strategically positioned near Allied reinforcement routes to harass troop transports heading toward Guadalcanal or intercept supply convoys pushing deeper into the South Pacific. Among these picket submarines was the RO-34, a medium-sized vessel built for stealth rather than shock. It carried torpedoes capable of breaking a destroyer in half and a deck gun for finishing damaged ships. In the spring of 1943, it patrolled waters where American destroyers regularly hunted for enemy surface traffic. The USS O'Bannon, commissioned only months earlier, was one of the most modern destroyers in the fleet. A Fletcher-class ship, she carried 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and an array of depth charges more firepower than some pre-war cruisers. But even a ship armed to the teeth was vulnerable in the dark if a submarine managed to get close enough. The Pacific at night offered cover to both hunter and hunted. American destroyer crews knew the danger well. They trained constantly for night encounters, learning to read shadow patterns on the water, to listen for engine vibrations, and to recognize the faint outline of a conning tower even before a radar return appeared. Many sailors found themselves relying on instinct as much as instruments. The Japanese were masters of operating silently on the surface. By April 1943, nighttime tensions were at their peak. The campaign for Guadalcanal had ended only a few months earlier, but its lessons were still being absorbed. The Navy understood that Japanese submarines preferred to run on the surface after dusk to recharge batteries and reposition. That made them faster but also potentially exposed if an American destroyer happened upon them without warning. This was the fragile balance on the night of April 5, 1943, as the O'Bannon moved through open water northeast of Vella La Vella. The ship held a steady course, engines humming, radar operators sweeping the darkness for contacts. The air smelled of warm salt and oil. Routine watch reports drifted across the deck. Nothing seemed out of place. Yet beneath that calm, the Pacific was full of shapes hidden just below the threshold of vision. Crews on both sides understood that a sudden encounter at close range could unravel even the best-laid plans. Destroyers needed distance to bring their guns to bear. Submarines required time to dive. When either was denied those seconds, survival depended on improvisation. Destroyer captains often briefed their men on unusual contingencies. How to react if a surface submarine appeared directly alongside, how to maneuver out of torpedo arcs, how to blind an enemy lookout before he could raise an alarm. Flashlights, signal lamps, and even pocket torches were part of the standard equipment on WatchNet as weapons, but as tools for identification and coordination in low light. No one aboard the O'Bannon imagined that one of those simple tools would determine the outcome of a confrontation. For now, the ship continued its course, unaware of the submarine moving somewhere ahead and aware that the night would soon collapse into a single instant of surprise at point-blank distance, where conventional tactics would be useless and where reflexes and small decisions would matter more than heavy guns. And it is in this tense, unseen approach that the wider background of the confrontation begins to take shape, leading us deeper into the events that set the stage for the encounter itself. The destroyer-submarine encounter that would later become famous for its bizarre flashlight maneuver did not arise from a single moment of chance. It emerged from the layered pressures that defined naval warfare in 1943. Shifting front lines, exhausted crews, and the constant interplay between technology and instinct. Understanding the backdrop requires stepping into the operational demands placed on ships like the USS O'Bannon during this phase of the Pacific Campaign. By spring, the Solomons had turned into a grinding contest of attrition. The United States sought to isolate the major Japanese stronghold at Rabaul, while preventing reinforcements from slipping south through the island chains. Destroyers were tasked with aggressive patrols and nighttime sweeps missions that forced them to operate deep in contested waters, where a hidden submarine could lurk anywhere beneath the waves. These patrol routes were not random. Naval intelligence tracked patterns of Japanese submarine deployment, plotting likely intercept points around islands such as Vella La Vella, Kolombangara, and New Georgia. Though the information was never perfect, it gave American commanders a sense of which ocean corridors posed the greatest threat. The O'Bannon frequently sailed through these very lanes, escorting convoys one week and hunting enemy craft the next. Japanese submarines, meanwhile, were under increasing pressure to disrupt Allied momentum. Their missions demanded both patience and nerve. Running on the surface at night allowed them to recharge batteries and reposition efficiently, but it also made them vulnerable if detected. Crews learned to minimize noise, reduce lighting, and keep watch for the dark outlines of American destroyer ships that had become feared enemies after months of fierce night combat. The RO-34, the submarine involved in the encounter, was operating independently during this period. Its role was not to strike major capital ships but to harass supply routes and exploit any opportunity to damage American operations in the Central Solomons. These patrols were long and stressful. Japanese submarine crews rarely surfaced during the day, working in hot, cramped conditions with limited food and air circulation. At night, the opportunity to breathe fresh air and observe the sky made surface running a welcome reprieve but also a dangerous necessity. As the O'Bannon moved northward that night, radar provided the crew with their best early warning capability. But radars of the era were far from flawless. Sea clutter, atmospheric interference, and the low profile of a surfaced submarine could all delay detection. It was not unusual for a surface submarine to escape radar identification entirely if it approached from a shallow angle or if waves masked its return. Visual watchstanders were therefore indispensable. Lookouts trained their eyes to pierce the darkness, to distinguish the faint difference between a rolling wave and a conning tower, to trust a flash of intuition when something didn't look quite right. Many encounters in the Solomons began with a whispered report from a sailor on the forward deck who thought he saw a shape where none should exist. At the same time, destroyer captains drilled their crews relentlessly in close-quarters reactions. Because the Pacific's sudden night engagements often closed distances to a few hundred yards or less, commanders emphasized decisive action over perfect analysis. If a submarine surfaced unexpectedly at close range, depth charges were useless, main battery guns were too slow to align, and torpedoes were impractical. Survival depended on turning the ship, outmaneuvering a potential torpedo threat, blinding the enemy's crew, or using smaller weapons to disrupt their actions long enough to gain an advantage. These unorthodox possibilities were discussed openly during readiness training. Sailors understood that at night, seconds could decide the encounter. Any hesitation could allow a submarine captain to order a crash dive or fire a point-blank torpedo. On the night of April 5th, the O'Bannon's crew believed they were alone in the darkness. The engines beat a steady rhythm through the hull. The decks glistened with the faint moisture of tropical air. Radar operators scanned without finding a contact. But somewhere ahead, the Row 34 glided on the surface, unaware that a destroyer was closing the distance at speed. The Pacific had aligned two vessels on intersecting paths, one rising into the night to recharge batteries, the other advancing through the gloom on a routine patrol. Neither crew had planned for a confrontation at knife-fight range. Neither expected an encounter measured not in miles, but in yards. And as these two shapes moved closer beneath the starless sky, the stage was set for a moment that would pass into naval folklore, one where improvisation would triumph over firepower, and where the smallest beam of light could tip the scales of survival. In the darkness of the Pacific, battles were often won not by brute force, but by the steady hands and steady nerves of the men who served on the decks. The story of the flashlight trick begins not with equipment or tactics, but with the human reality aboard the USS O'Bannon crew living under the constant strain of a war defined by uncertainty. Destroyer sailors slept lightly. Every noise mattered. A sudden engine change, a shouted order, or the unmistakable clatter of men running to stations could yank them from sleep in an instant. They learned to move with practiced urgency, to snap into combat roles even before their minds fully caught up. Life aboard a Fletcher-class destroyer was cramped. Heat pressed through the hull even at night. The smell of diesel, sweat, and gun lubricant never faded. Yet amid these conditions, crews formed a bond forged by shared danger. They understood that survival depended not on one man, but on how seamlessly each reaction aligned with the next. The night the RO 34 surfaced directly ahead of them was exactly the kind of moment they trained for, but hoped never to face. In the darkness, at a range measured in yards, fear flashed through the crew as quickly as adrenaline. This proximity left no time for debate and no room for hesitation. Officers and enlisted men alike had only fractions of a second to decide: turn, fire, or attempt something entirely unconventional. It was this human instinct, the ability to react with creativity under extreme pressure, that shaped the encounter. The flashlight, an object so ordinary that it barely merited notice during routine operations, suddenly became a decisive tool. The men who wielded it understood that light could disorient, confuse, and control an enemy crew unprepared for such a shock. This improvisation did not come from manuals. It came from sailors who had spent months searching the night for hidden threats, who understood how the human mind reacts when confronted by sudden brightness after hours spent scanning darkness. And it came from the recognition that at such close range, any tool, no matter how small, could become a weapon if used effectively. The story of the flashlight moment is ultimately a story about people. About watchstanders whose eyes caught the outline of a submarine, officers who made rapid decisions, and sailors whose instincts would define the outcome of a night neither side had expected. Naval warfare is built on distance. Destroyers attack submarines from hundreds of yards away with depth charges. Submarines fire torpedoes from safe standoff ranges. Main batteries on surface ships rely on time, elevation, and precision. Yet in the early hours of April 5, 1943, the O'Bannon and RO 34 met at a distance so close that nearly every traditional tactic collapsed instantly. When the submarine appeared off the destroyer's bow, the range was too short for the main 5-inch guns. Their minimum depression kept them from aiming at a target almost directly beneath them. Torpedoes were useless because the destroyer was nearly on top of the submarine. Depth charges could not be dropped without risking severe damage to the O'Bannon herself. Even the submarine's weapons were similarly constrained. Firing torpedoes upward at that angle risked them striking the ocean's surface or failing to arm. This created a rare moment of mutual vulnerability. At such proximity, tactics reverted to the oldest principles in naval combat: maneuver, surprise, and rapid disruption. The captain of the O'Bannon ordered a hard turn to starboard to avoid ramming the submarine. The decision left the destroyer skimming alongside the RO-34, so close that sailors could see the expressions of the Japanese crew on deck. Ramming was technically an option, but a dangerous one in wartime. A destroyer damaged beyond propulsion could be as vulnerable as any wreck. With ramming avoided, the O'Bannon needed a way to keep the submarine from diving or bringing its deck gun to readiness. Every second the submarine remained on the surface increased the destroyer's advantage. Every second of delay diminished the submarine's. This tactical stalemate, two vessels locked in parallel, each trying to outmaneuver the other, was broken not by torpedoes or machine guns, but by blinding light. Small handheld flashlights, usually reserved for signaling or maintenance work in dark compartments, suddenly found a new purpose. They were directed straight at the Japanese crew, at their faces, their eyes, their instruments. The effect was immediate. The submarine's sailors, whose eyes had adjusted to the deep night, were momentarily overwhelmed by the brightness. The disruption prevented them from manning weapons or executing a controlled dive. In a tactical environment defined by fractions of a second, the flashlight created a window, brief, fragile, but decisive. It was enough for the O'Bannon to gain momentum, pull away, and reposition for a proper anti-submarine attack once distance allowed. Here, tactics shifted back to traditional doctrine. Depth charges, coordination between sonar teams and bridge officers, and the destroyer's agility in tight turns. Yet none of this would have been possible without the initial disruption. The tactical angle of this encounter shows how doctrine bends under pressure, how small actions shape larger outcomes, and how naval engagements can hinge on improvisation. When distance, normally a navy's greatest asset, suddenly vanishes, the Pacific theater pushed naval technology to its limits. Radar, sonar, torpedo design, and hull construction evolved rapidly between 1942 and 1944. Yet even in this age of technological advancement, many encounters were ultimately shaped by the limitations of the tools involved. The USS O'Bannon carried cutting-edge equipment for its time. Its SG surface search radar could detect ships miles away under ideal circumstances. Its sonar systems offered a means of tracking submerged submarines with remarkable precision. And its depth charge array, with adjustable fuses, was among the most feared anti-submarine weapons in the Pacific. But technology, especially at night and at close range, was imperfect. Surface search radar struggled with small profiles. A submarine running low on the surface, bow slightly submerged, could blend into sea clutter. The RO-34's silhouette was especially difficult to pick up. Its conning tower was compact, its hull shaped to minimize detection. In heavy humidity and shifting air density common conditions in the Solomons, even the best radar operators could miss a contact until it was almost too late. Flashlights, by contrast, were primitive by any technical measure. Small, handheld, and powered by simple dry cell batteries, they were among the least sophisticated tools aboard the ship. Yet their simplicity made them effective in a moment when advanced systems offered no help. No radar beam could blind a lookout at close range. No sonar ping could freeze a deck gun crew poised to open fire. Technology on a destroyer formed a layered defense: radar for distant threats, sonar for submerged dangers, guns for approaching craft. But at the very bottom of that ladder were the simple tools that crewmen carried on their belts or clipped to bulkheads. The flashlight belonged to this category, a minor piece of equipment that suddenly became central to survival. This angle reveals an irony of naval warfare, that in an age of expanding sophistication, the encounter would hinge not on an electronic system or a new weapon, but on the oldest form of tactical advantage: control of vision. And as light shattered the darkness between the destroyer and the submarine, the entire engagement shifted, leading naturally toward the next angle of analysis: Leadership aboard a destroyer in wartime was measured not only in strategic competence but in the ability to make split-second decisions under overwhelming pressure. The confrontation with the RO-34 is a case study in how command presence, clarity, and decisiveness can determine survival long before guns or depth charges enter the equation. When the RO-34 surfaced unexpectedly ahead of the O'Bannon, the destroyer's captain faced an immediate and severe dilemma. A wrong order could doom the ship. Ramming risked catastrophic damage. Maintaining course might allow the submarine to fire a torpedo. Bringing guns to bear was physically impossible at that distance. Leadership required instant calculation, not theoretical perfection. The captain's first choice ordering a hard turn to avoid collision was not simply instinctive. It reflected a deep understanding of the ship's handling characteristics. A Fletcher-class destroyer could respond quickly, but not without a margin of risk. The wake of a sudden turn could disrupt the submarine's attempt to maneuver, while also preventing the destroyer from overshooting into a vulnerable position. Once the turn placed the ship parallel to the RO-34, another leadership challenge emerged: maintaining composure among the crew. Sailors stood only yards away from enemy personnel. One panicked shot from either side could escalate the confrontation into a deadly exchange in which neither ship had tactical advantage. Leaders had to keep their men focused, ordered, and responsive even when adrenaline pushed them toward immediate action. The decision to use flashlights as a temporary measure did not come from manuals, it arose from officers and petty officers who recognized that disorientation was their best available weapon. Leadership in that moment meant allowing innovation to surface, even from unexpected sources. A rigid command style would have suffocated the improvisation that the situation demanded. After the O'Bannon gained distance, leadership again became decisive. Re-establishing tactical doctrine, bringing sonar teams online, coordinating depth charge patterns, and regaining offensive posture required a shift from improvisation back to disciplined procedure. Combat leadership at its core is the ability to guide both transitions, from structure to improvisation and then back to structure. This angle shows that the flashlight trick was not a comedic improvisation as later retellings sometimes portray. It was a reflection of leadership that recognized the value of every available tool and the necessity of clarity during chaos. And it prepared the ship to execute the next phase of the engagement, one defined by the enemy's experience of the same moment. To understand the significance of the flashlight maneuver, one must consider the encounter from the perspective of the RO-34's crew. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized stealth, patience, and surprise. Their strength lay in controlled ambush, careful positioning, and disciplined interpretation of sonar and visual data. What the RO-34 did not train for was a destroyer appearing directly beside it in the middle of the night. From the Japanese perspective, the encounter began as a nightmare scenario. Surface submarines were at their most vulnerable. Their deck guns, though useful, required moments to prepare too long when an American destroyer loomed almost within arm's reach. Their torpedoes were angled for horizontal firing at such a short range they were nearly useless. The first shock for the RO-34's crew was visual. An enormous shadow materializing out of the darkness, its bow slicing dangerously close. The second shock was auditory, the churn of propellers reacting at high speed. Orders shouted, footsteps pounding. And then came the unexpected, almost surreal element, the sudden burst of bright light aimed directly at their faces. For Japanese sailors whose eyes had adjusted to the dim night, the flashlights created instant disorientation. Vision blurred. Depth perception faltered. Communication fractured. A few moments of blindness on a submarine's deck could mean the difference between an organized crash dive and a fatal delay. In these conditions, the RO-34's crew had little chance to mount an effective response. Submarine operations relied heavily on coordinated timing. Lookouts reporting, officers issuing orders, helmsmen reacting. When the crew could not see, even simple tasks became impossible. The destroyer's maneuvering wake added further instability, making footing precarious. This enemy perspective highlights why the flashlight tactic succeeded. It exploited not just physical vulnerability, but psychological overload. The Ro-34 was caught in a liminal space between operating modes, too far along in surface operations to dive instantly, too close to the destroyer to use weapons effectively, and too overwhelmed to think clearly. Understanding the Japanese experience of the moment adds gravity to the encounter. It was not comedy. It was confusion, fear, and the recognition that the balance of power had shifted in seconds. And it created the conditions for the destroyer to transition from improvisation to deliberate attack. War at sea often evokes images of sweeping battles and grand strategy. But in moments like the Obanan Ro-34 encounter, warfare compresses into something deeply psychological, a contest of perception, instinct, and human vulnerability. The flashlight maneuver reveals the thin lines separating order from panic. Both ships were crewed by men trained for complex technological combat, yet the critical moment hinged on something primal. Vision versus blindness, light versus dark. Psychologically, the destroyer crew held an advantage the moment they acted. Initiative was not just a tactical element, it was emotional dominance. By immediately disorienting the Japanese crew, the Obanan's sailors asserted control over a chaotic situation. The sudden illumination shattered the submarine crew's expectation of darkness and disrupted the mental framework that governed their actions. For the Americans, the action reinforced confidence. A crew that had just faced an unimaginable danger now held the upper hand. That morale surge translated directly into effective coordination during the follow-up depth charge attack. For the Japanese, the effect was the opposite. Panic, even momentary, erodes cohesion. The Ro-34's crew experienced a cascade of psychological fractures. The shock of unexpected confrontation, the vulnerability of surface exposure, and the disorientation of bright light. These reactions were not failings, they were human responses to sensory overload in a deadly environment. The moral angle also highlights a fundamental truth of naval warfare. Survival often depends not on technology or doctrine, but on adaptability. The flashlight episode underscores the blurred line between improvisation and necessity, between ingenuity and desperation. And with tension rising on both vessels, this psychological imbalance pushed the engagement toward its decisive moment, the turning point that would determine the fate of the Ro-34 and define the legacy of that night. The moment the USS Obanan pulled away from the Ro-34, the confrontation shifted from surreal proximity to deadly intent. The flashlight beams had done their work, creating a brief window in which the destroyer could disengage without giving the submarine an opportunity to dive or man its deck gun. But that window was rapidly closing. The Ro-34's crew, recovering from their initial disorientation, scrambled to regain control of their vessel. On the Obanan, the bridge moved with sharpened purpose. Orders cut through the night with crisp urgency. The ship's helm swung the destroyer into a widening arc, increasing distance while avoiding the danger of passing directly in front of the submarine's bow position that could expose the destroyer to a last-ditch torpedo shot if the Ro-34 regained offensive posture. Sonar operators prepared for immediate contact. Their equipment was calibrated for submerged targets, but the crew knew the submarine would attempt to dive as soon as it recovered its bearings. A surface submarine was exposed, a submerged one could vanish within seconds if not tracked instantly. Lookouts continued to observe the Ro-34, calling out its movements in real time. The submarine's crew, shaken but not defeated, began the sequence for a crash dive. Men scrambled into the conning tower. The deck gun crews abandoned their attempt to organize a defensive stance. The submarine's bow dipped slightly as ballast tanks began to flood. The destroyer had only seconds to reassert control. With distance now sufficient to safely deploy anti-submarine weapons, the Obanan accelerated and maneuvered into a position to pass over the submarine's projected dive path. The destroyer's engines churned the water as the ship gained speed, the vibration of the hull signaling to every man aboard that the ship was entering the most dangerous phase of the engagement. The depth-charge crews rushed to their stations. On a Fletcher-class destroyer, depth charges could be released from stern racks or hurled laterally from K-gun throwers, creating a pattern designed to corner a diving submarine. The efficiency of this system depended entirely on timing release too early, and the charges detonated above the target. Release too late, and the submarine slipped beneath the lethal envelope. As the RO-34's conning tower dipped under the waves, the destroyer's sonar team picked up the faint, unmistakable signature of a submarine beginning its descent. The contact was shallow, only tens of feet beneath the surface, meaning the submarine had not yet gained depth control. This was the moment American destroyers trained relentlessly for. The brief interval when a diving submarine was most vulnerable. The captain of the O'Bannon ordered a depth charge run. The crew responded with practiced precision. Charges rolled off the stern with heavy thuds, disappearing into the wake. Seconds later, the K-guns fired, launching additional charges outward in a tightening semicircle. The ocean hissed and churned as the explosives fell toward their programmed depths. The crew braced. Moments stretched long. Then the sea exploded. A series of detonations cascaded through the water column, each blast sending a concussive shockwave radiating outward. The O'Bannon's hull shuddered under the force, rattling metal fixtures and vibrating through deck plates. Sonar screens flickered as interference washed over them. The RO-34, caught in the upward transition between surface and dive, suffered the full violence of the attack. Submarines were most fragile when shallow, their hulls were not yet reinforced by water pressure, and their internal compartments were still in transition. A close detonation could buckle plating, rupture ballast tanks, or disable propulsion. But the destroyer crew could not assume victory. Anti-submarine warfare demanded confirmation, and submarines, especially Japanese ones, had survived astonishing punishment in past encounters. The O'Bannon prepared for a second run. As the destroyer circled, sonar operators strained to regain contact through the echo-filled water. Slowly, a new return emerged, faint, irregular, suggestive of a vessel struggling rather than maneuvering. The captain ordered the ship to realign for another attack. Depth charge crews reloaded with speed born of experience. The night remained black, broken only by the dull glow of red lamps and the faint sparks of machinery. The ship accelerated again, wake foaming behind her. A second pattern of charges dropped into the sea, spaced to strike a submarine attempting evasive action. More detonations tore through the water. This time, the shock waves were followed by a subtle but unmistakable sign. An expanding patch of disturbed water rising to the surface, flecked with debris. A bubble of oil spread across the waves, reflecting dim light in shimmering streaks. Sonar returns dissolved into silence. The RO-34 had ceased to maneuver. Yet the destroyer did not immediately assume the submarine destroyed. Protocol required confirmation. The O'Bannon slowed her engines, gliding over the debris field. Lookouts scanned the water for survivors, objects, or structural fragment soil markers of a successful kill. The Pacific gave up more signs, pieces of wood, minor debris, and a widening slick that indicated internal rupture. No movement. No diving noises. No re-establishment of contact. The ship maintained readiness guns manned, sonar active, but the tone aboard shifted. Tension began to ease. The flashlight moment, surreal and improvised, had led to a decisive attack executed with precision and discipline. And yet the climax was not finished. A single submarine could not define the full consequences of the encounter. What mattered next was what the attack meant strategically, psychologically, and operationally for a fleet fighting to maintain control of one of the Pacific's most contested corridors. The final turning point of the engagement would unfold not in the explosion itself, but in what followed. For the men aboard the RO-34, the ocean had become a coffin long before the O'Bannon appeared out of the night. Japanese submarine crews operated with far fewer resources, far less radar capability, and under far greater strain than their American counterparts. Their boats lacked the advanced air search radar that US submarines increasingly relied on. Their doctrine forced them to operate close to enemy shipping lanes at periscope depth, waiting silently for chances that came rarely and often ended badly. That night, the Ro-34 surfaced to recharge her batteries, an unavoidable necessity. After hours submerged at cautious patrol depth, her diesel engines needed air, and her crew needed a moment of relief from the stifling heat below decks. Men stepped out to the conning tower to breathe cooler air, unaware that fate was moving toward them on a fast-approaching bow wave. When the massive silhouette of a Fletcher-class destroyer materialized out of the dark, it was not simply an enemy ship, it was a death sentence. The crew had no time to engage their deck gun. No time to turn. Not even time to dive. Their training demanded action, but the sheer proximity of the destroyer stripped them of options. Every instinct told them that this was the end. Their fear, their paralysis, and their shock all formed part of the strange equilibrium that followed. And it was inside this narrow space between action and inaction that the so-called flashlight trick would find its unexpected opportunity. Most naval battles were decided by firepower, maneuvering, or technology. But the encounter between the O'Bannon and Ro-34 hinged on something almost never discussed in official reports: confusion. In close combat situations, the brain reacts not with logic, but with instinct. Under the shock of surprise, militaries, even well-trained ones, can freeze, react poorly, or misinterpret threats. The O'Bannon's officers understood this instinctively. They knew that the submarine's deck crew was unprepared, disoriented, and still processing the fact that a destroyer was nearly on top of them. And that was the exact moment when an unconventional tactic held disproportionate power. A simple flashlight beam directed at the enemy wasn't just light. It was a psychological weapon. Blinding. Disorienting. Unexpected. A sudden beam into a sailor's eyes destroys night vision instantly. It erases depth perception. It creates the illusion that the enemy can see more than he truly can. In a split second, that burst of light shifted the balance of awareness entirely to the destroyer's crew. They could observe. The submarine crew could not. The submarine officers had no idea what weapons were being trained on them. They only knew that the Americans were reacting quickly and deliberately. And confusion in war is more than a momentary lapse. It spreads like electricity, first to the eyes, then to the mind, then to the decision-making process. By controlling the enemy's attention, the destroyer's crew bought precious seconds. Seconds that would shape the course of the encounter. The Pacific in 1943 was full of emerging technologies: radar, sonar, improved torpedoes, better gunnery systems. But none of these mattered at 15 yards. At that distance, modern war broke down into something ancient. Sailors reacting to danger with their bodies, not their equipment. The O'Bannon's officers had radar readings, rangefinders, and fire control computers. Yet none of these tools were designed for a target that was so close the destroyer's guns could not depress far enough to fire. Instead, the crew relied on raw seamanship: helm control, situational awareness, instinctive judgment of water and motion. It was the kind of skill sailors had used for centuries, long before radar ever existed. The Japanese submarine faced a similar paradox. Submarines were designed for stealth and distance. Their torpedoes required range. Their deck guns needed time and space to be manned. Their dive procedures demanded at least a few seconds to initiate. But the ocean stripped both sides down to fundamentals. Who could react faster? Who could think clearer in the dark? Who could turn instinct into action? And it is in this collision of high-tech warfare and primal reflexes that the story finds its most human meaning. Technology may shape the battlefield, but in the end, it is still people who decide its outcomes. And aboard the O'Bannon, those people were seconds away from the turning point. a turning point that would take this strange nighttime standoff and transform it into one of the most unusual close-range confrontations of the Pacific War. The destroyer's bridge erupted into controlled chaos the moment the lookout shouted the submarine's silhouette. Officers called bearings. Boots pounded across steel decks. Men snapped to stations, but the reality was unavoidable. The O'Bannon was too close to fire her main guns. The barrels simply couldn't angle downward far enough to engage a target practically alongside her bow. The destroyer thundered forward, her hull cutting so near the Japanese submarine that some sailors swore they could see the startled expressions on the enemy crew. The sea around both vessels boiled with wake and vibration. Any misjudgment, any slight turn could have sent the O'Bannon ramming straight into the surface submarine. And while that might have crushed the Row 34, it could also have opened the destroyer's forward hull like a tin can. The decision fell to the bridge. Do not ram. Clear the submarine. Create space. It was a gamble. And it needed seconds the Japanese could use to man their deck gun and fire at point-blank range. But those seconds never came. Because on the destroyer's forward deck, sailors had acted with unusual instinct. They shined their flashlights bright, concentrated beams directly onto the submarine's deck crew. It was not a tactic taught in manuals. Not a doctrine. Not something recorded anywhere before that night. It was improvisation born from shock, adrenaline, and a sailor's understanding of how darkness works. The beams hit the Japanese sailors full in the face, erasing their night vision instantly. Men who had spent hours in the soft glow of red-lit compartments and dim moonlight suddenly found themselves blinded. Their hands hovered over equipment they could no longer see clearly. Their depth perception vanished. The destroyer, towering above them, seemed even more menacing in the abrupt light. In that fragile moment, confusion became the destroyer's most effective weapon. The Japanese deck crew froze not because they lacked courage, but because the human mind cannot respond effectively when its senses are overwhelmed. They needed to blink, to shield their eyes, to look away from the piercing beams. Those lost moments denied them the one thing they desperately needed: action. Meanwhile, the O'Bannon's officers seized the opening. Hard left, rudder now. The ship heeled, water spraying from her bow as she carved a turn around the submarine. The destroyer didn't slowing meant giving the submarine the chance to fire its deck gun or begin its dive sequence. Instead, the helm kept speed, trusting the turning radius and the crew's awareness to prevent collision. The distance widened from mere yards to tens of yards. Still dangerously close, but no longer suicidal. Now the destroyer had options. On the Japanese submarine, the officers finally began shouting orders. The deck crew scrambled. Hands reached for the deck gun, attempting to swing it toward the turning destroyer. But even then, the flashlight beams clung to them like a spotlight on a stage, disorienting and infuriating. They tried to adjust, but their reaction time lagged behind the Americans' movements. And then, as if stirred by instinct more than orders, the American deck crew reached for anything at hand. Potatoes. Mess supplies. Ironically, mundane objects that had been brought topside earlier in the night. Sailors began hurling them partly as a distraction, partly as a way to keep the Japanese heads down, partly because it was the only thing they could do while the ship maneuvered out of the kill zone. The night erupted into one of the strangest close-range exchanges in naval history: flashlights and flying objects on one side, blind confusion on the other. But beneath the absurdity was something far more serious. These actions, unorthodox, improvised, even comical by later retellings, bought the O'Bannon the time it needed. Within seconds, the destroyer had completed her turn. She was now clear of the submarine's hull. Her guns had the angle. Her depth charges were primed. The moment of decision had arrived. Because once clear of the immediate danger, the destroyer would unleash the full weight of her firepower and the night would shift from improvisation to lethal precision. And it is into that deadly phase of the encounter that the climax now moves, as the O'Bannon prepares to strike back with everything she has. The instant the O'Bannon cleared the submarine's beam, the destroyer transformed from a startled bystander into a predator. The hesitation was gone. The confusion had served its purpose. Now the crew shifted with practiced precision into combat posture. Stand-by depth charges. Forward battery prepare to engage. The shouted commands rippled down steel passageways, echoing into compartments where sailors snapped to readiness. The ocean still churned from the destroyer's sharp turn, the wake curling around the submarine's hull like a tightening noose. On the Row 34, the Japanese crew finally managed to swing their deck gun toward the American ship. Their eyes were still recovering from the sudden brightness, their movements frantic but determined. They were fighting not just an enemy vessel, but blindness, shock, and the crushing realization of how quickly the tide had turned. The O'Bannon now held the advantage distance, maneuverability, and firepower. Her 20mm and 40mm guns came alive first, their tracers ripping across the night sky like white-hot needles. They hammered the submarine's exposed deck, forcing the Japanese crew to abandon their positions. Metal clanged. Sparks flew. The deck gun fell silent before it ever fired a shot. Then came the main battery. The 5-inch guns roared, each blast shaking the destroyer's frame. The flashes illuminated the Pacific in brutal strobes, brief frozen images of men, machinery, and steel under siege. The round struck the submarine's conning tower and hull, tearing into the thin plating that Japanese submarines were notorious for. Smoke poured from the impact points, drifting across the dark surface in ghostly trails. But the submarines still floated, and the Americans knew exactly what that meant. A wounded submarine was the most dangerous kind. If the Row 34 managed to slip beneath the surface, even half damaged, it could set up a counterattack, launch torpedoes, or vanish into the black water to fight another day. The O'Bannon couldn't allow any of those outcomes. The order was immediate and decisive. Depth charges ready. The destroyer thundered past the submarine, maneuvering to the perfect angle for a run. Sailors at the stern waited for the signal, their hands hovering over the release mechanisms. Each charge was a steel drum of explosive force meant to collapse hulls and shatter metal deep underwater. But timing mattered. If dropped too early, they would miss. Too late, and the submarine might already be diving beyond reach. The Japanese captain understood this. The moment the destroyer passed his bow and began to circle into a depth charge lane, he made the only move left to him. He ordered an emergency dive. Bells clanged. Men scrambled below. Pumps whirred to life, flooding the ballast tanks. The submarine shuddered as it fought to submerge a wounded beast, trying to escape into the dark depths. The O'Bannon's sonar operators shouted readings from below decks. Target descending fast. Depth change detected. Above, the destroyer's captain watched the surface for the telltale swirl left by a diving submarine. When he saw Ita distorted whirlpool shape a hand slice through the air. Drop! The depth charges rolled from their racks, disappearing into the water with heavy splashes. They sank in silence for a few heartbeats, sinking toward the fleeing submarine. Then the ocean erupted. The blasts tore through the water, sending towering plumes skyward. The shock waves rolled across the destroyer's hull like distant thunder, rattling metal, vibrating teeth. The night lit up with brief, fiery bursts beneath the surface violence hidden just out of sight. Sonar confirmed it moments later. Multiple contacts. Metallic echoes. Then nothing. Silence. The kind of silence that meant only one thing. The Row 34 was gone. Whether she broke apart immediately or sank slowly into the crushing depths, no one aboard the O'Bannon could say for certain. But the lack of returning sonar pings, the absence of a rising periscope, the lack of torpedo wakesail told the same story. The submarine had been destroyed. The destroyer's crew stood on deck in the fading echoes of the explosions, some catching their breath, others gripping rails, others staring into the black water where moments earlier an enemy vessel had fought for survival. The adrenaline faded slowly, replaced by relief and the sobering understanding of how narrowly they had escaped disaster. One misjudged turn, 1 second of late reaction, one gun barrel angled a little differently, and the O'Bannon could have been the one sinking into the Pacific. Instead, she was moving forward again, engines humming, radar sweeping, men returning to their stations with a renewed sense of vigilance. Because even after the submarine disappeared beneath the waves, the night offered no guarantee of safety. The war still covered every horizon. But the destroyer had survived thanks to quick maneuvering, human instinct, and one of the strangest improvised distractions in naval history. The ocean slowly settled into its natural rhythm, the last ripples from the depth charge explosions fading into the black expanse. A salty wind swept across the O'Bannon's decks, carrying with it the sharp smell of cordite and churned seawater. The men aboard the destroyer felt the familiar mix that followed every life-or-death encounter: relief, threaded with exhaustion, triumph, laced with unease. Because victory at sea was never clean. The sinking of the Row 34 was not celebrated with cheers. There was no shouting, no applause. The crew simply returned to their stations, checking equipment, restoring order, and waiting for the next contact. The Pacific War didn't allow sailors the luxury of dwelling on close calls. Each night could bring another submarine, another air attack, another moment where survival came down to seconds or inches. Reports were drafted. Logbooks recorded the engagement with the detached formality required by naval procedure. Enemy submarines sighted at close range. Maneuvered to avoid collision. Fired main battery and light weapons. Dropped depth charges with confirmed sinking. What those entries did not capture was the human reality behind the words, the frantic scramble of the deck crew. The blinding light of flashlights cutting through the heated night air. The uncanny improvisation that kept the Japanese deck guns silent long enough for the destroyer to break free. Nor did they capture the psychological aftermath. For many aboard the O'Bannon, the surreal nature of the encounter lingered. Sailors replayed the moment when the two vessels nearly collided, when the Japanese crew stood only yards away, visible in the dim glow of night, just as startled as the Americans. They remembered the sudden improvisation, the instinctive use of flashlights to blind the enemy, the unexpected barrage of objects hurled in desperation and defiance. And beneath the strange details lay a deeper truth. Their survival had hinged not on technology or firepower, but on a split-second human reaction. In the following days, the story began making its way quietly through the ship. Men shared versions of it during maintenance work, during meals, during the rare moments of downtime. Some laughed softly at the absurdity. Others shook their heads, unable to forget how close they had come to disaster. The tale of the flashlights and the improvised barrage became a piece of shipboard lore long before historians ever heard of it. But even as the story grew among the crew, the Navy's official communications treated the sinking with clinical brevity. No report praised the ingenuity of the sailors. No document highlighted the oddity of the encounter. What mattered was the result. One less enemy submarine in the Pacific, one more successful action logged by a Fletcher-class destroyer. The O'Bannon continued her patrols. Radar operators scanned the horizon without pause. Sonar teams listened for the faint echoes of propellers deep below the surface. Every man on board knew that the Pacific was full of submarines just like the Row 34 boats that surfaced in darkness to breathe, to recharge, to survive until dawn. And yet, after that night, the destroyer's crew moved with a sharper awareness. The encounter had reminded them of the unpredictability of naval warfare. Technology could fail. Radar could miss a contact. A submarine could appear at impossible range. And in those moments, improvisation mattered just as much as training. The O'Bannon steamed onward, leaving behind the quiet grave of the submarine she had sunk but carrying with her the strange, unspoken understanding that war could bring not only terror and tragedy, but also moments of improbable human ingenuity. Moments that deserve to be remembered. In the weeks that followed, the strange nighttime encounter between the O'Bannon and the Ro-34 began to filter upward through the Navy's command structure. After-action reports moved from the destroyer to the squadron leadership, then to fleet intelligence, and eventually reached the desks of officers far removed from the realities of Pacific patrols. Most saw only the essentials: a surfaced enemy submarine, a close-range engagement, rapid maneuvering, a successful sinking. It was another tactical victory in a war defined by number ships sunk, tons displaced, patrol areas cleared. But then there was the supplemental detail. The line in the narrative that caught the eye of analysts and officers alike. Close proximity prevented main battery engagement. Deck crew employed improvised measures to disrupt enemy gun crew while ship maneuvered for attack. The phrase improvised measures stirred curiosity. Officers who dug deeper learned the real story: flashlights, blinding beams, and the now infamous barrage of potatoes and mess supplies. The simplicity of it was almost unbelievable. In a theater dominated by sonar contacts, torpedo doctrines and radar innovations, a destroyer had survived through an act of pure instinct. Word spread informally across the fleet. Not as an official tactic, no manual would ever include such a thing, but as a piece of naval folklore. Something shared between crews at anchorages. Something retold at mess tables aboard other destroyers. A tale that blended surprise, humor, and deadly seriousness, reflecting the surreal nature of war at sea. And yet, behind the levity, there was respect. The Pacific was merciless. Submarines stalked destroyers as eagerly as destroyers hunted submarines. Encounters could end in minutes. Lives could be lost without warning. Sailors understood better than anyone how narrow the margins were. The story of the O'Bannon's encounter was not merely amusing, it was a testament to quick thinking under impossible pressure. Fleet historians took note of the sinking, though early reports focused almost entirely on the tactical elements. Only later, as sailors who lived through the war began to share their recollections, did the flashlight story take on its full shape. Veterans' reunions preserved the memory. Oral histories recorded decades later gave it permanence. The absurdity of the moment destroyerman hurling potatoes to keep a Japanese gun crew off balance would eventually become one of the most retold anecdotes of the Pacific campaign. But beyond the humor, the incident held deeper significance. The Ro-34 had been one of many submarines struggling to maintain effectiveness that late in the war. Japanese naval logistics were failing. Fuel shortages strained operations. Mechanical issues went unaddressed. Submarines were forced to surface more often, to operate longer in hostile waters, and to endure greater risks. The loss of even a single vessel tightened the noose around Japan's maritime lifelines. Meanwhile, the O'Bannon's survival reinforced the danger American destroyers posed in the Pacific. Agile, heavily armed, and increasingly equipped with cutting-edge radar and sonar, the Fletcher-class ships were becoming the spearpoints of nighttime operations. Their encounters with submarines were shaping new patterns of engagement, ones where technology and instinct had to blend seamlessly. The encounter on April 5, 1943, captured that blend perfectly. It showed the importance of training, but also the necessity of adaptability. It revealed the limits of technology, but also the power of human improvisation. And it reminded everyone from sailors on deck to admirals in distant headquarters that war rarely unfolded according to the neat diagrams in doctrinal manuals. As the months passed and the O'Bannon continued her wartime service, the memory of that night remained part of her identity. It was a story passed down to new crew members, a reminder of what their ship had survived, and a symbol of the unpredictable nature of combat at sea. The Pacific War would grind on, relentless and unforgiving. More battles awaited. More submarines lurked beneath black waves. More destroyers would face split-second decisions in the dead of night. But the legacy of the O'Bannon's encounter with the Ro-34, that strange mix of danger, ingenuity, and humanity, would endure long after the war's final shots faded. And from that memory, we move into the final reflection, where the lessons of that night widen beyond the ocean, into the broader meaning of warfare and the people who endure it. The Pacific War is remembered for its vastness, its towering carrier battles, its island assaults, its sweeping movements across thousands of miles of ocean. But history is often shaped not only by the grand maneuvers of fleets, but by the fleeting moments when individual sailors, caught in the narrow space between survival and destruction, make choices that ripple far beyond their immediate horizon. The O'Bannon's strange encounter with the Ro-34 endures because it reveals something essential about warfare at sea. Amid radar screens, sonar echoes, and meticulously written doctrines, there remains an irreducible human element. Machines extend a sailor's reach, but they do not replace the instincts forged by training, hardship, and the simple will to live. That night in April 1943, two vessels met under circumstances no tactical manual could fully prepare for. A submarine surfaced at the wrong moment. A destroyer appeared out of the dark. Both crews were blindsided. Both faced impossible proximity. And in that precarious balance, survival came down to clarity of mind and a willingness to improvise. The flashlights used to disorient the Japanese crew were not a weapon. They were an instinctive response, simple, immediate, unexpected. They remind us that even in the age of industrial warfare, small actions can alter the trajectory of a battle. Not because of their physical power, but because of their effect on the human beings caught in the moment. The sinking of the Ro-34 was one more entry in the long, painful ledger of the Pacific War. Yet the story behind it, of sailors confronting danger at arm's length, of fear mixing with ingenuity, of humor intertwined with mortal risk, offers a rare glimpse into the lived reality of naval combat. It is a reminder that history is not shaped solely by admirals and strategies. It is shaped by the people on deck at 2 a.m, staring into darkness, reacting to the unexpected with whatever tools they have at hand. In a war defined by vast distances and overwhelming firepower, the survival of the O'Bannon came down to a beam of light in the night and the human instinct to act when it matters most.